Back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Venezuela. We haven't discussed that for a few weeks on this show. There is a UN representative currently in Venezuela to assess the impact of the American sanctions on that country. They've been in place for a number of years now, but have been intensified, of course, especially certainly under the Trump administration since 2015. The U.S. government's accountability office, known by its abbreviation GAO, has acknowledged, in fact, in the recent past, that its country's sanctions on Venezuela have in fact killed many Venezuelans or have led to conditions that have killed many innocent Venezuelans. The UN representative herself, while she is in the country, I believe she's in the country till today, Friday that is, will be assessing the situation, i.e. the impact of the sanctions, as well, of course, as the government's own role in how to deal with the sanctions and to improve the lives of Venezuelans overall under such tough conditions, both political and otherwise. Let's discuss that all a bit further. We're now joined with Dr. Maria Puertorriera, who is an adjunct professor at political science and sociology at Valencia College and Ana G. Mendez University. She's joining us this morning from Orlando, Florida. Joining us this morning from Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, is Jesus Rodriguez, who is the editor of Orinoco Tribune. Jesus and Maria, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Maria, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the UN representative being in Venezuela, and what's your opinion overall about sanctions as they've been placed by the U.S. on Venezuela?
Good morning, Waqar. It's always great to be with you. I think it's important for them, for the UN, to have access to the country. And I think it's important to know that sanctions are not the only tool that can be used in this case in particular. But the problem has been that, first of all, we really don't know the extent to which the damage is as bad as it looks. I'm afraid it can be worse, but not because of the sanctions per se. I'm not saying they are not bad. I'm just saying that they are hurting those that are not intended to be the target, and that the regime, Maduro's regime, is using them as an excuse for their own failure. The effectiveness of sanctions depend as much as the entity that is issuing those sanctions, but it also depends on how other countries contribute to that reinforcement. And we know that Venezuela has had many, many countries helping them to avoid the impact of those sanctions. And that has mitigated some of the harm that is intended to those in the government to be, affected by those targeted sanctions. So I'm afraid that with the help of the UN mission, we're going to find much worse information about this.
Jesus, you're on the ground there. So tell us how bad is the situation? How much of that then economic situation being dire is the responsibility directly of the American sanctions?
Hi, thank you for inviting us. First of all, I have to tell you that the effects of the sanctions are real, and most of the ordinary Venezuelans are the ones that are paying for it. I mean, that are suffering it, especially with a lack of income that the state is not receiving. That affects everything, because Venezuela was sanctioned mainly on PDVSA, which is the state oil company, and that has put a humongous damage on the government, because the government right now lacks a lot of income. Actually, President Maduro said that we only receive like 3% of what we were that we received in 2018 in terms of revenue. So you can imagine a state that received 100 2 years ago and right now is receiving like 3. So that's to give you an idea. So the situation is complicated. I have the impression that the government and the Venezuelan people has been facing it with a lot of courage and resilience, and I have the impression that besides being terrible, there's a positive side of the sanctions that are forcing us to try to do things better. And if going to your question directly, I would say that that I mean, a lot of the problems that we are facing right now in Venezuela, most of them are right now are the result of the sanctions. Of course, there's a problem with corruption and bad management. But if you ask me, of course, I'm a very Chavista guy. I will tell you that I believe that that's a small fraction of the negative effects that we have been seeing in Venezuela. And those effects are, as I told you, the services are terrible. We have a lot of scarcity of gasoline lately, and a lot of things that are not working properly because of the lack of resources.
Okay, so Maria, let's look for a moment, if we can, at the macro issue, right, of the U.S. role in Venezuela as a whole. We can talk about Guaido, we can talk about a lot of things, but do you think in some ways that there's actually that goal of the U.S., whatever we may term that goal to be, has failed?
I think it has. It has because on the one side, Trump's intention was for regime change, and sanctions are not very effective for regime change. We've seen it before. We've seen it in Cuba. We've seen it now in Nicaragua as well. So I think the strategy was bad from the beginning, because sanctions are a means to persuade someone to do something or to stop doing something. And that's not the case in terms of what Trump was aiming to do, which was for Maduro to step down or agree to an election. They will not agree on doing anything that will remove them from power. So that was absurd. The problem is that there was this sense or the image, the messaging of the sanctions was pretty much that it was going to produce some cracks that never happened. There were no fractures, and he's pretty much in charge with a solid, robust control of power. So I think the effectiveness was very limited. And I believe that this conversation has a lot to do with the fact that there were conditions previously in the economic infrastructure and the activities in general that, as your other guest has suggested, the country's dependence on oil revenue is so huge that you can see the consequences of it. There's no private businesses that can survive because they are so minor in comparison with the whole size of the economy depending on oil. And when you cut that from the government who is in charge of it, you have nothing. So the country is barely going by with the very little things like the use of dollar as the main currency, unofficial main currency. That tells you a lot about how the economy is working right now in terms of a structure that was previously overtaken.
So, Jesus, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What happens next, do you think, looking into the next days, months, years, Jesus? Guaido, at least, it's quite clear, does not have the support of all Venezuelan peoples. He may have, some point in time, had some support, but that seems to have died down. How does one bring all Venezuelans together? Because that's the important thing, right? To have all citizens, or as many citizens, unite, right, within a country. How does that happen, do you think?
That's not an easy question, especially when you're in front of a polarized country like the case of Venezuela. I cannot offer you like a definitive answer. I wish we could bypass all the polarization that politically talking have arisen in Venezuela in recent years, or maybe for in the last 2 decades, especially since Hugo Chavez took power. But that's a reality. We are living with it. What you say, and I believe is absolutely right, is that the Guaido project has blown up in the face of Washington and a lot of right-wingers that were hoping that it will erase Maduro and Chavismo out of the face of the earth. And that takes me to the other analysis. It was not only like U.S. sanctions or European sanctions against Venezuela. I mean, we are talking about a holistic approach from the U.S. to get rid of Maduro's government. So we are talking about a very heavy diplomatic initiative. The Guaido project itself, like the crazy idea of having someone in the public street proclaiming himself as president of a country, which is a terrible precedent for the humanity. And the other side are the sanctions. So there's a bunch of and there are other levels of the regime change operation against Venezuela, but the good thing is that it haven't succeeded, and one might ask it oneself, what is the reason for that? If you only listen to the mainstream media, you will see that they will always say that Maduro's in power because of he controls the military and because of Cuba, Iran, and Russia, and China, and whatever. But they don't pay attention that there are like millions of Venezuelans that are Chavistas that are supporting him. So I believe that's very important to highlight because, I mean, you cannot erase something that is real. I mean, you cannot get rid of that easy, and that's why Maduro is still there. And I believe that anyone that takes that into consideration as a fact will make a good approach to finding a better political solution to the political polarization that we have in Venezuela.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final comment, but we appreciate both of our guests for taking their time out this morning to share their expertise with us. We were talking there about Venezuela, specifically the American sanctions effect on the Latin American country. As both of our guests there spoke about, it's not just a question of sanctions that plays a role in why the economy is this bad in Venezuela at this time. Mismanagement, corruption, all of the above is probably also all a part of the mix which need to be addressed as well. But the sanctions certainly do not help, and they're not appreciated by the Venezuelan people themselves. Again, sanctions have been discussed in many contexts, right? Russia, Iran, and we can probably talk about other countries apart from Venezuela as well that have been under sanctions. Have those sanctions succeeded in overthrowing any of those respective governments? They have not, but they've in fact made life just harder for those nations' respective citizens. So you're not winning any hearts and minds. In fact, you're probably just creating further animosity towards your own respective ideals. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break.